The former president of Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe, has died. He's one of the last leaders of Africa's independence struggles. He died at a hospital in Singapore. Mugabe ruled for decades, first as prime minister, later as president. But by the time he was deposed in the military coup in 2017, a man once seen as a democratic freedom fighter was reviled as a dictator by many of his own people. We begin with this report from Hoda Delamid.
The liberator who turned into a tyrant, the man who destroyed a promising country through his determination to cling on to power. Adored by some, but in the end despised by many in Zimbabwe, although widely admired across Africa as a hero who fought colonialism and stood up to the West. 1965, Rhodesia and Ian Smith's white settlers declared independence from Britain, an event that defined Robert Mugabe's life and still haunts his country. The black majority resisted racist rule in the cities and out in the countryside, where a vicious bush war raged for years. Robert Mugabe, a teacher turned activist, emerged from prison as an articulate leader of the independence struggle.
We started the war in order to get our country, and we haven't got our country.
They did get their country at Lancaster House in London in 1979. And when Zimbabwe celebrated independence, Mugabe, the overwhelming winner of elections, was in power, and soon showing rival liberation fighters what he'd do to keep it. Matebeleland in the early 80s, the opposition crushed, thousands killed in ethnic massacres, atrocities that were barely noticed abroad.
They killed the people, they killed the people, they killed women, and pregnant women, they just killed those pregnant women.
But there was also much to admire: racial reconciliation, education and health for millions of Zimbabweans. Although later the economy declined and the invasions of white farms in the year 2000 were a turning point, this time the world did notice.
People said that this was going to happen, it was going to turn into a bloodbath, turn into another Congo. Maybe this is it. We're going to have to get out of here.
It was a chaotic, destructive process, but Mugabe said he was correcting an old injustice and in many ways still fighting the old colonial power.
The land is ours, we give it to whom we please. It's not the business of Britain, you see, to tell us who to give land and who not. Whether those who are given are members of my party is irrelevant to Britain.
By now, opposition was growing. Despite torture, murder and manipulation, many Zimbabweans seemed ready to throw Mugabe out. They had a new hero, Morgan Tsvangirai, who said Robert Mugabe's early achievements will always be overshadowed by the years of oppression.
Do we portray him as the great liberator, or do we portray him as somebody who has betrayed the liberation that he fought for? I think the latter will prevail.
The two rivals ended up in government together, although Mugabe made sure he kept the real power, and Tsvangirai later returned to opposition, where he would eventually die.
Mugabe is constantly showing how hypocritical the West is, and Africa loves that. And it's for that reason that I think Mugabe will be judged ultimately as being a more important figure in Africa than simply a despot. He is a despot, he's a dictator, he's a tyrant, he's any word you want to throw at him, but he's something more than that. He's the wrong messenger with the right message.
By now, his wife Grace, 41 years his junior, had emerged as a political player. Mugabe, well into his 90s, seemed determined to go on and on.
Journalists, tell those you are representing that the Robert Mugabe is still here, well and strong.
But not as strong as he thought. In the cities, anger boiled over. A new generation demanded Mugabe go.
It's time for you to resign. It's time for you to step down.
In the end, it was the army that pushed him, worried he'd appoint Grace as his successor. A former colleague and deadly rival of Grace's, Emerson Mnangagwa, took over. It was more palace coup than revolution, although the joy mirrored that of Zimbabwe's original revolution 37 years earlier. Mugabe retreated to his mansion, bitter to the last.
We don't deserve it. Please, we don't deserve it. Zimbabwe doesn't deserve it.
The real tragedy, Robert Mugabe could never bear the idea of his country enjoying a second freedom from his ruinous grip. Huda Abdelhamid, Al Jazeera.
Haru Matasa joins us on the phone now from Johannesburg. So, Haru, the news is only broken within the last hour or so. How do you think this will be received in Zimbabwe, considering the very complicated legacy and rule of Robert Mugabe?
Well, he was a controversial leader, so likely there'll be mixed opinions from those who supported him and those who really didn't like him. Right now, at the radio stations, people have been calling in, some of them giving their condolences, some of them who are mainly opposition supporters and didn't really have any good feelings about him, were saying that maybe it's an end of an era and it's unfortunate that his legacy has been tainted. What's likely going to happen today is there could be some kind of a gathering at the ruling ZANU-PF headquarters in Harare, where many of his supporters will come and try and pay his respects. He is a complicated figure because many Zimbabweans, especially those who remember the Liberation War, those who grew up in the 1980s and 1990s, he was still pretty much seen as the darling of Africa. So people saw him as one of the founding fathers of Zimbabwe. He helped in white colonial rule. He was a teacher, and one of his main things was educating his people. That's why you hear globally people will say Zimbabwe has one of the highest literacy rates in the world. There are those who applaud him for what he did with land, whereby despite international pressure, he went and took land from white commercial farmers. A lot of blacks who felt that it wasn't right that a white minority controlled most of the good land actually applauded that. But then his critics say there was an agenda. Some of that land is not being used. Some of that land allegedly went to senior ruling party officials who aren't fully utilizing it. They blame him for corruption in state companies, state entities. And they say as he was getting older, he was losing grip on power. It's alleged that some people, including his wife Grace, were probably trying to tell him what to do, tell him how to run the country. That's why some people, even within the ruling ZANU-PF party, were very not happy with Grace, wanted her out, and eventually wanted him out, which is what happened in 2017.
So yeah, let's talk about 2017. It was a bit of a drawn-out process. He was finally ousted by a military coup. Do you think that perhaps he was given a little bit of goodwill because of what he had done 30 years ago?
Exactly. There's the Mugabe the good, there's the Mugabe the bad. As a Zimbabwean, as a black Zimbabwean, a lot of them felt that, yes, he wasn't perfect, but at the same time, you can't forget some of the good things he did, not just for black Zimbabweans, for Africans as a whole. When you travel the continent, you still get some people who see him as a liberator. They'll say Mugabe is one of the few African leaders who was brave enough to stand up to Western countries. He was brave enough to take land. I mean, for example, in South Africa, they're still talking about a land reform, what to do about it, how to do it properly, to try and please everyone, which, of course, is not going to happen. One side is not going to be happy if and when land is expropriated. So a lot of Africans say he was a hero in that sense. But the average Zimbabweans who, after decades of living under alleged human rights abuses, oppression, the economy in particular was a bitter pill for a lot of people to swallow. Zimbabwe from the 1980s used to be called the breadbasket of Africa. The country could produce its own food and export it. After land reform and, of course, various droughts over the years, the country's been struggling to feed its people. So a lot of good and bad with Mugabe's rule. But now I think initially the officials in Zimbabwe will try and obviously make arrangements to bring the body back home from Singapore. They'll tell people what the funeral plans will be. And then from there, we'll get a general reaction from both sides in Zimbabwe, opposition and ruling party, for what they thought about Mugabe.
Haru Matasa, thank you very, very much for that wrap-up. Thank you. Let's bring in Privilege Musvanhiri, who's a journalist joining us now from the Lake Kariba area. He's in an area that President Mugabe is from, Mashonaland West. So thank you so much for joining us. So let's talk about this and the knowledge that you have of the area that Robert Mugabe is from. How is he thought of there?
It's mixed. others take him as a liberator and others take him as a dictator. I think that's the legacy that he is leaving. For the side of the liberator, they take him as a man who was able to stand up against white colonial rule and who would speak out his mind whenever he would be on the international platforms. On the other hand, the other years, people will speak about the things that happened under his rule. You talk of how the economy was managed and also the legacy that he has left, which even the current administration is trying to correct in terms of how the economy performed, because it has been a difficult one for them to shake it off and get the economy to start running again.
Privilege.
So there are mixed reactions to that.
Let me ask you about that, about this transition from a freedom fighter to a dictator. What drove that?
I think when the Liberation War happened, the whole agenda was to take the country out of the shackles of colonialism. I think as the years went by, power is sweet and it corrupts as well. So that could have happened along the way, that he could have been genuinely a liberator, but later on switched side, and because of the sweetness of power, he became a dictator. And some of the things that even if you are to speak to people right now, the other legacy that is living, it's issues of corruption, because under his rule, you had a lot of leaders, even people in his government, who would do some of ridiculous things, stealing from the state coffers, but you'd never see those people going behind bars. So I think that could have happened. He started out as a man who wanted to liberate the country, but ended up, switching side because of the sweetness of power.
Privilege, I think the saying is power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So going forward in the next few days, how do you think his funeral services, his remembrances will be, considering he is reviled by some and loved by others?
I think at the time that we are at right now, the events that have happened, in the past year, you have had, people coming, talking about sentiments of saying, oh, though he was a dictator, maybe he was better because of what the economy is going through right now. So I think the remembrance and even the coming days, you will find, yes, of course, he has died with all these labels, but I think he is going to be remembered as one of the father figures of Zimbabwe's liberation. In our local language, we have a saying that if somebody dies, people would rather talk of his goodness than the bad. If you go to a funeral in our local settings, you'll find people who never talk about the bad, but they will talk about the good that one who would have gone was doing.
Okay. Privilege Musvanhiri, thank you so much for your insight. We appreciate it.